Today I want to discuss a data type structure called a data structure called a struct, S-T-R-U-C-T. And a struct is something that you use when you want to contain a set of data that is related but of different data types. So for example, if we were using an array or a list or a vector, they would have to be of the same data type. They would have to be of data type string or data type int or something along those lines. But with a struct, we can collect data that have different data types, and that makes it very usable for us. There are going to be times when we want to have related data and pass it in a way where what we're going to pass is a single variable. So for example, you could pass a single variable to as a parameter to a function or something along those lines. And that's something you simply can't do with an array or a list if there's different data types involved. So the first thing I want to do is go over how to create a struct, which is really simple, and also how to use it in a couple of different ways. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up as variables, and we're gonna pass it some variables and retrieve those variables. And then I also want to go over how we would do this if we were going to collect a whole bunch of data and use this struct kind of like a class, and use it for arrays and also for vectors. So a struct and a class are very similar, and it depends on the school of thought as to which one you should use. I myself prefer to use classes to do the same job when I'm going to write a program. However, there's really not terribly too much of a difference other than a struct. Your data is going to be set to public, versus a class is going to be defaulted to private. And so that's really about the only real difference. There might be some other technical differences, but in my experience, I usually am going to want to use a class, and so that's typically what I'll do. So we have our usual code set up, where we're our starter code, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and construct the struct. So the reserved keyword is struct, and we're going to call ours courses because I'm going to pretend that we're talking about different classes. Remember, the data should be related, and so this just seemed like a good example of one where your data would be related. I almost always use what's called an object ID, and that's just I'm an old database person, so I'm used to identifying my records with an object ID. So that's the reason that I'm going to call this first field an object ID, just to uniquely identify every row once we start collecting rows in our later examples using an array and a vector. But for our first example, we're just going to be constructing the struct and entering data and pulling data out of the struct. So I'm going to use char for grade since it's a single character, and for our last one, just to make things different, we'll use a string and we'll just say title. Okay, so that concludes how you set up a struct. This is how we declare it and initialize it. Struct, and the name of the struct is going to be courses. The elements of the struct are going to be int object ID, char grade, and string title. And so this is the construction of the struct. All right. So in here, let's go ahead and get rid of this. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to set this up a little bit so that we can get ready to do some examples. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is set up the variables. And we need to say what we need to call our struct and set it up to start using it. So the first thing we do is we say courses. So we need to do this. And so it's a data type. We're going to say, okay, our data type is courses, and now what are we going to do with it? Well, I need to set up what I'm going to call it. So I'm going to call mine courses underscore var, and now I have my data type courses var, and now I can actually assign some values to it. So I'm just going to do this the old-fashioned way where I do the old cut and paste. But let's say courses var dot object ID. Your different options are going to come up, and I'm going to just say 0. So I'm going to say here and do that again. And this time we're going to say grade works for me, and we're going to set that to, since this is a chart, we need to use the single quotation. And the next one we're going to do is going to be let's see, how about, well, title. That's the only 3 we have, and we're going to call this one, just for fun, computer concepts. Let's say it's a class, the name of a class that we're actually taking. Okay, so that's how you assign your courses. So here we called the data type courses. We assigned it to courses underscore var as the name of our object. And then here we're going to say, okay, our object of type courses underscore var, we're going to name the first element object ID right here. We're going to assign that value 0, and for the dot grade, we're going to assign that value A, and title computer concepts. So we've assigned some information, to some data to our variables, and now what I'm going to go over is how you pull information from those variables. And so I'm going to code a little bit, and then I'll explain. So what I did was I added these lines right here, line 26 through 28, and what they do is I declare some variables, int object ID, char co, string ti, and I assign them to the different values that we collected in the courses object. So the struct element course underscore var object ID, which we assign 0, A, and computer concepts, are all here, and I'm going to pull them out here. Of course, I could actually just pull them out directly here, but I did this. The reason I did this is because I wanted to demonstrate that if we were using this in a program, you probably would want to pass them into a variable and then use that variable to do something with. So this is a really simple example of how to create to construct your struct, how to assign how to enter your values or your different elements with the different data types, and then how to call that struct right here under courses. We call it right here. So we're going to call the struct courses, or excuse me, the data type courses is going to be the struct. We're going to call that struct, and we're going to access its values. And so here we're going to say courses underscore var. This is going to be the name of the object courses, and then we're going to use courses underscore var, and we're going to call the different elements of it in order to give it some different information. And me, normally I like to line up my equal signs and my values. It's just the nerd in me likes doing this kind of thing. So anyways, so this is just a really simple example. We'll go ahead and run it and show you what that looks like. So here we go, and you can see the variable examples is output here. The value 0 is output here. When we call it right here, when we call the object ID on line 30, is output here 0. The A is output here on line 31, and of course the title computer science under TI on line 28 is line 32 is output right here, computer concepts. So we constructed our struct, we populated the struct, and we retrieved information from the struct. And so it's really valuable, but now we're going to do a little bit more with it. And in order to do that, the next thing I want to demonstrate is I want to demonstrate how to use it in an array, because typically we're not going to use our struct just to pass one set of information. Usually we're going to iterate through it and populate it with a lot of information and then pass a single variable that contains that information. So I'm going to go ahead and explain that here in a moment. Alright, so I'm just going to keep working on the same piece of code here, and we'll just keep expanding it. So the next thing is we're going to call this one arrays, because that's what we're going to do here. We're going to say array. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing I did up here with the output, or to output to the console, except for this time it's not going to be variables, it's going to be an array. Array, all right. And so the next thing we want to do is, just like we did up above, we have to assign the object courses. We have to create that object. So we're going to call courses, the data type courses, and we're going to, this time though, it's going to be an array of courses. We'll go ahead and do uppercase courses underscore, and this time we're going to say RR for array, and we're going to just create an array of element size 2, index 2, our element size 2, I guess, and now we can start to work with the array. So what we're going to do now is we're going to say, okay, and just to save time, I cut and paste a lot, because unfortunately I've had surgery on my right wrist, and I just don't have the typing speed I once had, so I have to do a lot of cut and paste these days. Okay, so I'm tired too. I can't believe myself, sorry. Okay, so we're going to do this, and what we're going to do is we're going to start calling the objects from the courses array. So I'm going to take a moment, I'm going to type this up, and then I'll be back and I'll explain it. Okay, so here what I did, the new material that I added to the code is on lines 41 through 47. We called the new array that we created of data type courses, and so now we have courses underscore ARR for courses array of two. It's going to contain 2 elements. So here's courses array, and the first index is 0, and then the next index is going to be 1, and we add object ID, grade, title, and this time I enter some different information. So this one's going to be, I guess, 0 again, and C, an introduction to programming, 1D, introduction to programming. I guess I could make this to we'll just call it programming 2 just to be different. I don't know why I made it the same, I guess because of my cut and paste habits. So we'll just say programming 2 just to make it a little bit different. Okay. So now we've populated it, and we can pull information from it. So I added the for loop, and typically in an array or a vector, we use a for loop to retrieve information from the array. So here's our array. We again, it's an array of data type courses. We added our we accessed the different elements of the array, and we assigned them some different data sets or data information, I guess. And so let's clean this up a little bit here. So there's two pieces of data that we've added, and we're going to use a for loop to now retrieve that information. And the for loop works just like any other for loop. We have an integer, we declare I, we're going to set it to 0, and we're going to access elements or indexes 0 and 1. So I will grow and stop it when it hits 2. Of course, over here it means it's going to increment by 1. So I will be 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, etc., etc. It's never going to reach 2 because when it hits 2, it's going to stop. And so that's how we will retrieve the information from the array. I want to point out that this is probably also how you would populate your array. You most likely would use a for loop, and you would populate it in the same manner, using a for loop with i's and assigning it to this information that you would retrieve, maybe from a file that you read in, or a database, something along those lines. I hard-coded it here just so that you could see visually how it's populated. If we did it in an array, it would be a little more complicated, or I mean in a for loop, it would be a little more complicated to explain. But to retrieve it, I think, is clear. So here we're populating the information, and here we're going to retrieve it. Okay, so we're now at the point where we can run this, and let's do that. Okay, so we still have our variables example retrieving its information up above, which is from up here, this example here on lines 20 through 32 that we did. And now, though, we have the new one, which is the array example. And the array example is retrieving our let me get this, scroll up a bit, our 0, our C, our introduction to programming, the 1, the D, and the programming 2 in the for loop of the array, and outputting it to the console. So you can see the output here. So this is set up correctly. I'll kill this over here, and we can take a look again. So again, this is the top part here. We have the struct. We're accessing the struct in the main in the main function, and we're demonstrating how to pull the variables, how to populate the variables, and how to pull the variables. And then with the array that we just did, we did the same thing. We entered information into the variables, into the array, and then we retrieved information from the array. Again, I like to point out that I'm not a fan of the array because you have to know the number of elements that you're going to be using. So we had to know that there's going to be 2 elements and then populate it. A lot of times we can do that in the programming. We can anticipate that, or we can programmatically calculate that the amount of information we're getting is going to be, let's say, 100 lines of code, 100 lines of data or information, and so we can set up our array accordingly. But a lot of times you don't know that, so that's why I almost always prefer to use vectors. So this is just another good example of how we're going to use a vector, and this time we're going to use a vector with a struct. So it's going to be kind of cool. I think this is kind of my favorite part of this piece of code, and so I'm going to demonstrate how to do that here. But the very first thing we have to do before we can do anything else is we have to create the object vector up on top. So underneath the struct, so that the vector can use the struct, we're going to go ahead and use we're going to create our vector. So we'll do this, and actually I'm going to okay, so I added some code. On line 14, we went ahead and created the vector function, and that's because I'm going to be using a function this time along with our vector and our struct. So we're going to be combining some different data types that we've been using, some data, and I think that's going to be fun. Okay, so we have vector of type courses. So courses is here. The vector is going to have access to these objects here, and we have the function that we're going to call pop vector, and then vector courses. Again, this is just the way that you have to construct your function. And in my function, what I'm going to have is I'm going to be passing it. I'm going to be passing it another vector, so it's going to, this function called pop vector is going to return a vector of type courses. That's what this part here means. And it's going to take as a parameter or as an argument, it's also going to take a vector of type courses, and it's going to take an integer, ID, a string, an int, and a string. So a lot's going on with this function, pop vector. Again, it's taking in a vector, it's taking in an int, a couple of ints and a string, and it's going to return a vector. Okay, so at the bottom of this code, I went ahead and wrote the function. I added the function here called the pop vector, which had to be declared up on top, right up in here, and now it's down here. And what I did was add the function, and all this is going to do is it's going to assign to the vector courses, CV vec, it's going to assign it this information into these different elements of the object. And so once it assigns it to these different elements of the object courses, then it's going to return that vector. So again, it's taking in a vector and some information, and then it's going to populate it, and then it's going to return the vector. So that's what's happening with this function called pop vector. Okay, so back up in here, we're ready to add some code under the array example. So here was the end of our array example. We're going to add some vector code now. So what I did here is I added a whole bunch of code in this vector function, and or not a vector function. This is still part of the main function. And so what's happening here is I did the usual output to the console that says this is a vector example, and now just like we did with arrays and with variables, we said we're going to create a vector, and this vector is going to be of data type courses, so it's going to have access to the struct information right here, the struct objects. And so that's what this part here means. And now I go ahead and I assign my courses course vec underscore vec. And what I'm going to do now is start assigning information to those objects. So in this first example, lines 67 through 70, we take courses vec, object ID, assign it to 3, and then grade to F, and title to C++ programming, the title. And then here's the keyword that you're used to from my other video on vectors. We're going to push back to the CVec that we created up right up in here on line 64. We're going to push this information into that vector. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add another piece of information. We're going to say, okay, let's do this again. Let's add some more information to the vector. So now all I did is repeat the process and push back into the course's vec. So now CVec has both of these two sets of data. I wanted to do something else. So lines 67 through 75 is how you would manually or hard code the information to go into the vector. But most of the time you're going to be calling a function to populate your data. And so I wanted to go ahead and show you how that would work. So on line 77, we take the same function, CVec, the same vector, CVec, and we're going to pass it to the pop vector function that we created down here, line 87 through 97. So we're going to call this function. And this time we're just going to pass it some information. The first thing that we're going to pass it is we have to pass it a vector of type courses, which is what the CVec is. So we're going to pass it CVec. Now remember, CVec is already going to contain the information that was added up in here, lines 67 through 75. So it's already coming with some data. Now we're going to add some new data. We're going to add this 5, this COP 2222, a T, and programming. So we're adding some additional information to the vector that already contains information. Okay, once that happens on line 77, it's going to be populated down here in the function, and now CVec will return right here. CVec is going to be assigned the original CVec with its information that was populated up here with this new information. And so line 77 is the way that you would typically populate a vector that is using a struct to contain multiple data types. So again, let me actually separate the screen a little bit. So back up in here, there we go, there's our struct. So our struct right here, we have access to these different data types and to pass it in a single object called courses. So right here, we're accessing those objects, those different elements of the object, and we're passing it this information. And let me go ahead and clean this up a little bit too. And then, so this is line 67 through 75 is how you would populate it using hard coding, the way that we're just saying, okay, we want to assign this information to the vector while using the struct. And then line 77 is the way you would most likely do it in the real world. So in the real world programming, you're typically not going to hard code it. Usually you're going to be passing it something that is retrieved from a list or an array or a database or something. And so here's how we're doing that. We're going to pass the vector right here of data type courses and the information that it already contains, and then some new information, and we're going to pass it to the function list down here. So here it goes right in here, and those arguments are going to be accepted and pushed back into the vector, and the vector is going to then be returned on line 97. And so here it is, popular vector gets these arguments, gets populated into the vector, which is returned, and then CVec is now equal to what the vector that's returned. So when we pull this information out, this is going to look at CVec, check the size of CVec, and it's going to pull all the elements out of CVec. And so what it should retrieve is these information. So from line 67 through line 77, even though they're populated in a different manner. So let's go ahead and run that. Okay, so here we go, and get to the vector part. So here's the vector example. Here's 3F, C++, 22, C++ programming, and then the 4, the A, C++ programming again. Should have probably made that different. And then this information that was passed through the function, which was 5, T, and the programming. So that's pretty much it. For this example. Okay, so I made a couple of mistakes, and I want to point those out so that if you're copying this, you'll have the correct version. In the vector, I mistakenly added some information that wasn't being reflected here. So I think what was called string sec and something. So here, these have to be identical. I want to stress that again. Line 14 with line 87 must be identical. And so we're still passing it the vec as before. So the next thing is the integer ID, int ID, and char grade, string title, string title. So those must be the same. You can line them up like this and just look at them and realize they must be identical. Okay, and once these are identical, then of course what's in the function must be identical. So here object ID is the same, grade is different. I think I had it as .sec. Here we're going to use .grade equal grade that's being passed, and title that's being passed. And so this is the correct version of the function, of the vector function. Lines 14 and line 87 identical, and then line 92 through 94 must contain this information the same. If you're going to use it, the elements that you're calling in courses ID must be the same as what you're passing. Okay, so I just wanted to point that little error out. Once we run that, we get the vector example. We get our let's see. I'm going to go ahead and kill this part here. Okay, and we get our 3F C++ programming, 4A C++ programming, and then the part that we did, that we passed it as a function, we get that C++ programming, and well, I didn't do that part, 5, and then T, and then programming. So these all match. The output is correct, and all the different examples here. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll through the code so that you can see again how I did it. Again, to begin with, I used struct courses. Just as an example, I have my different data types, int, char, and string for the struct. And then the vector. This is because I'm going to use a vector class for populating my vector as if, the reason I did this again is because it'd be most likely to be populated inside of a for loop or some type of loop. So you're going to want a function to do that. So again, my function pop vector is going to return a vector of type courses, of data type courses, and it's going to accept a vector of data type courses, an integer, a char, and a string, so different data types. And let's go ahead and look at the bottom of that. So at the bottom here is that function pop vector, returning vector courses, the same information here, and then all we're doing with it is we're just populating the same data right into the vector and returning it. In this block of code, you could be doing something with it. You could be doing calculations or whatever, and then populating it. You could be doing if-else statements or case statements or something in here to manipulate the data before putting it back into the array. So this is where that would happen. All right. So back to the top, we have our function I just spoke about. In the main function, we have an example of the variable arrays, and we have our variables here. Again, we create an object of data type courses called courses underscore var. We populate it, the different elements here, and then we retrieve the information. I assign it to some different variables in lines 28 through 30, and then I write those variables back to the console in lines 32 through 34. And then on line 36, we create an array. And so this is an example of an array. Again, we create an array of type courses, data type courses. We have access to the same objects, the same parts of that struct, and we enter information twice manually, and then we retrieve that information in a for loop, and that's the end of the array. So I'll pause on the array. Here's our array, lines 36 through 56. All right, then we did the vector. The vector was a little bit more complex. Here we say this is going to be our example. We again we create an object called c_vec of data type courses, and it's going to be a vector. And then we populate our vector with the different data types with different information of different data types. We use the pushback reserved keyword to populate the vector. And then in line 77, I give an example of how to access a function called popVector, which takes a vector of data type vector and some other information, and then uses a function to populate the information and then return the vector back up here on line 77, and then it reassigns c underscore vec to the vector that was returned. Then we say, okay, what's actually in that vector? Then in line 79 through 83, we go ahead and we put it in a for loop. We check the size of the vector, and then we output all the information that's in the vector, which when we run is this information right here. And let's scroll it to the vector, and that's all this information right here. If we scroll down so we can see it all, there it is. Line 67 through, let's do a little bit more actually. There we go. All right, so again, I'll pause just on the vector. So here's your vector code. Special attention to line 77. Vector function. And that's it. And I hope you enjoyed this little training session on how to use a struct and how to use vectors and arrays in a variable with your struct.